Hello everyone, my name is Miranda Vazquez and I am your content presenter for week 3 for Psych 12 Advanced Social Psychology Group 2. The title of my presentation is called Social Perceptions 2, Stereotypes, Prejudice, and Discrimination. So we're going to start out by first defining what is social categorization. If you recall from last week's readings talking about the concept of the self, we learned that as individuals we create our perceptions of who we are largely from our social interactions with others. We do this in a number of ways, one of which involves the systematic classifying of ourselves and of other individuals into social categorizations or groups based on some level of perceived commonality. By assigning individuals to social groups or categorizations, we make it quicker and easier for our brains to process and interpret the vast amounts of incoming information about the characteristics of others. This saves us not only time, but also valuable cognitive resources. When we assign ourselves to a particular social group, we call that an in-group, meaning that we perceive that particular set of individuals to be similar to ourselves in some important aspect or another. This is the us group. On the flip side, when we differentiate between ourselves and a group of individuals with whom we do not consider to be similar to us, we are identifying what social psychologists call an outgroup or a they or them group. So in addition to saving valuable time and cognitive resources, social categorization has served other notable benefits as well. Research indicates that early social categorization may have contributed to an evolutionary advantage that allowed for increased chances of survival through in-group support and protection of like others, while remaining skeptical of individuals that did not belong to the same social group. From a more modern standpoint, social groups today fulfill our innate human desire for social connectedness and a sense of belonging, which in turn can have increased effects on an individual's sense of social identity and self-esteem. Segueing into social identity, our self-esteem, according to Casson, is made up of primarily two components, a personal identity and a social identity. Here we're going to focus on the social aspect of identity. Recall from last week's readings that across cultures, individuals appear to be motivated by an innate desire to maintain a positive self-concept. In terms of our social identity, this means that we desire memberships in social groups that we consider to be valuable in some way. Otherwise, our self-esteem would suffer by affiliating ourselves with a group that we do not see value in. According to social identity theory, affiliation with these in-groups of perceived value enhances our social identity and in turn our self-esteem. By assigning distinct value to groups in which we affiliate ourselves, we display what is known as in-group favoritism, or the tendency to discriminate against other outgroups in favor of our own. This in turn can evoke other forms of discrimination, prejudice, and negative stereotypes that may serve to bolster our perceived in-group importance, as will be discussed next. Before we begin with the rest of our main concepts, I'd like to go over some brief definitions of some of the terms we will be elaborating on in the coming slides. First is the concept of stereotypes, which are generalized beliefs of what we consider to be typical traits that we assign to groups of individuals that belong to a particular social categorization. Oftentimes, these generalized beliefs about others have a negative connotation attached to them. Next is prejudice, which is a term used to describe the negative feelings that we associate with members of a particular social group. Lastly, the term discrimination refers to the unequal treatment of a person or a group of people based on their membership to a particular social group. These three concepts do not operate independent of one another, and so their definitions must be considered as interrelated concepts of a similar construct. Casson tells us to think of these three concepts as the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors behind the same phenomenon. Let's focus first on stereotypes. Recall from the last slide that these are generalized beliefs about traits that we consider to be typical of a group of individuals that belong to a particular social categorization. We start by asking how it is that stereotypes come about. Stereotypes do not originate from a singular source, but rather a number of different places. They are a product of cultural and socialization processes that begin the moment we're born. Recall that much of our self-concept comes from social interaction with others. In the same fashion, we learn through these early social interactions with members of our cultural in-groups, such as family members, about what the norms and rules of a culture are and what we should expect from others. I put the word expect here in italics because I want to reiterate the subjective nature of stereotypes, that they are typically perceptions that belong to members outside of the stereotyped group. Stereotypes can also be generated and reinforced through the aforementioned process of social categorization, in which we rely on preconceived stereotypes about others to help us understand individuals outside our in-group. Additionally, self-categorization causes individuals to exaggerate the perceived differences between members of other social groups compared to our own. Lastly, because our self-esteem is closely tied to our membership of our social in-group, we often rely on negative stereotypes of other social groups in order to validate the value of our own group in comparison. So now that we have an idea of how stereotypes are created, we can discuss some of the ways in which stereotypes are reinforced. The first and somewhat obvious reason is that repeated exposure of what constitutes expected and acceptable stereotypes of others through early communication or socialization processes affect some of our most instinctive thought processes. Oftentimes, stereotypes have become so ingrained in our brains through the ways that we've been taught to view the world and others that we don't stop to think and acknowledge or question these most basic long-held beliefs. As we sort of already covered in the last slide, stereotypes can also be reinforced through the process of social categorization, where we often falsely attribute ambiguous characteristics and behaviors of others in line with pre-existing stereotypes in order to reduce the ambiguity of the situation. In this way, we are engaging in what Casson describes as a confirmation bias style of thinking, in which we pay more attention to information that reinforces what we already believe to be true. Similarly, we fall victim to illusory correlations when we pay more attention to information that we expect to find or see and overestimate the value of that information for a given situation. Lastly, stereotypes can be reinforced through what are known as self-fulfilling prophecies, or instances where the stereotyped individual behaviorally reinforces the typical characteristic we are expecting in response to our own subtle, often unintentional, off-putting behaviors. The power of stereotypes lies in their ability to affect both the stereotyped individual or group as well as the perceiver of the stereotype itself. When we consider that most stereotypes about a group are often negative and that we've established a direct connection between an individual's self-esteem and the value placed on his or her affiliation with a particular social group, it can be concluded that negative stereotypes can have a direct effect on one's perception of self-esteem. This direct connection can be seen through situations involving what Casson calls stereotype threats, where fear of being negatively evaluated according to the stereotypes of one's social group causes observable cognitive and physiological symptoms of stress and anxiety and interferes with the individual's ability to perform a given task. Another powerful aspect of stereotypes is that they are often subconscious components of our thinking that can be implicitly activated without our conscious awareness. Not only that, but stereotypes also do not require our consent in order to be activated or to influence our decisions and behaviors, meaning that even if we do not agree with the stereotype itself, aspects of our behavior can still be manipulated by these implicit biases, which can lead to further acts of discrimination and stigmatization. Recall from our earlier brief definition slide that discrimination can be thought of as the behavioral component that arises from stereotypical thoughts and prejudicial feelings. Here I introduce an additional term, stigmatization, as referring to the persistent assignment of negative or devalued prejudices, stereotypes, and acts of discrimination one experiences as a member of a particular social group. Stigmatization can have detrimental effects for those who experience this type of ongoing and consistent discrimination, including lowered self-esteem, increased feelings of depression and anxiety, and decrease in overall life satisfaction. Discrimination can take on many forms. Our readings from this week focus primarily on two of the most commonly observed types of discrimination, racism and sexism. Racism referring to the unequal treatment or discrimination of an individual or group of individuals of a particular racial or ethnic group based on negative prejudices and stereotypes, and sexism referring to the unequal treatment or discrimination of a person based on his or her biological gender identity. Although these two forms are discussed in more detail than others in our text, Casson notes that there are numerous other forms of discrimination that can be based on a variety of characteristics such as age, weight, the presence of a physical or mental disability, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, and economic status, to name a handful. In the same way that types of discrimination can take on many forms, so can the level to which a discriminative behavior is exhibited. On the more extreme side, discrimination towards others may be displayed in a manner that Casson refers to as old-fashioned, referring to overt and obvious acts of discrimination towards an individual or group. On a less obvious scale, modern discrimination, then, is used to describe more subtle forms of discrimination that often go unnoticed as socially acceptable behavior during situations or conflicts that are more ambiguous by nature. A third type of discrimination, described as aversive, refers to discriminatory behaviors often operating on a subconscious level of biases that an individual holds, while the individual outwardly affirms that he or she is acting from a place of ambivalent intention. Just as stereotypes are both knowingly and unknowingly reinforced by individual behavior, so are acts of discrimination. As we have discussed, discriminatory behaviors are often reinforced through subconscious prejudices and stereotypes that individuals hold that can be implicitly activated and can subconsciously influence outward behavior. We see a prime example of this happening in one of the assigned articles for this week's reading by Bashir and her colleagues, where individuals made intuitive decisions on whether or not to join advocates of social change based on the assignment of pre-existing prejudices and stereotypes to all typical social activists. However, while some forms of reinforcement for unequal treatment of specific groups are more indirect, others are not. For some, individual self-esteem and assigned value in one's own in-groups takes precedence over notions of equality. According to social dominance orientation, those who align with this style of thinking are willing to continue to facilitate behavioral forms of discrimination towards others in order to achieve or to maintain perceived social dominance and/or importance. With both direct and indirect support for negative prejudices, stereotypes, and discriminations from so many different sources, we are faced with the question of what can we do to help? Casson ends this week's chapter with some suggestions as to how we can work to reduce these negative attitudes and behaviors. The first suggestion involves increased intergroup contact, which suggests that the more that we directly interact with members of social groups outside of our own, the less ambiguous members of outgroups become. Thus, the pre-existing prejudices and stereotypes that categorize ambiguous others into social groups can be substituted for actual knowledge about the cultural aspects of different social groups and their members. This can be achieved through increased cross-group friendships between members of social groups. The buffering effect of this increased intergroup contact can also be extended through indirect contact when another member of an individual's in-group becomes witness to these cross-group friendships or relationships. Another option Casson suggests that may reduce intergroup prejudices is to discover a common in-group identity that either recategorizes both groups into one superordinate or inclusive group, or to assign a dual identity that encompasses aspects of a common, shared identity while simultaneously acknowledging and valuing each group's level of distinctiveness. When we consider that personal biases occur on both a behavioral plane as well as a cognitive one, it makes sense for proposed solutions to also account for both aspects of change. In terms of cognitive solutions to reduce stereotypes, Casson suggests that personal biases can sometimes be managed through the practice of self-control. However, he notes that this approach may prove to be cognitively exhausting and therefore not feasible or guaranteed to work all the time or in the long run. One alternate solution might be to adopt a more multicultural style of thinking that incorporates points of view that acknowledge and value the distinct contributions that different social groups can provide for one another. Thank you all for watching and listening to my presentation over this week's materials. I will end here with 2 questions for further discussion for you all. The first one, when we think of ourselves as members of a Christian in-group with shared beliefs and ideals in line with the Bible's teachings, such as compassion and forgiveness, how do you think that this lens of perception might affect the ways in which we and our fellow Christians interpret or respond to prejudices, stereotypes, and acts of discrimination? The second question then, given the close relationship between social identity through membership of an in-group and perceived self-esteem, do you think that an individual's desire to maintain a positive self-concept will ultimately outweigh an altruistic desire for social equality?